Our next speaker is Helen Taylor, the Vice President of Impact at Exodus Cry. She'll speak of what she learned from 10 years working with women in the sex industry around the world. Helen is the Vice President of Impact for Exodus Cry, an international anti-trafficking organization committed to abolishing sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Exodus Cry has produced award-winning films and documentaries, including Nefarious, Liberated, which I have seen. They are amazing, eye-opening documentaries about the sex trade. And Exodus Cry has also launched global campaigns against Pornhub. Helen oversees Exodus Cry's outreach to victims of trafficking. She has trained over 3,000 individuals in 12 nations on outreach and led anti-trafficking initiatives around major world sporting events in Brazil and Russia. She is the author of Exodus Cry's Intervention Manual, a guide for reaching those in the sex industry, utilized in 28 countries. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'd like to dedicate my remarks today to every survivor of the global sex trade. Our fight is and always will be for you. I'd like to extend my most heartfelt thanks to CFAM and the permanent mission of Belarus and the Philippines. It is a tremendous honor to be here on an issue that I think we can all agree in this room is one of the most urgent and important of our time. 13 years ago, as a young student, I traveled to Cambodia for a summer where I was first exposed firsthand to the issue of trafficking. I later moved to that nation working as an art therapist and have been with our organization Exodus Cry for 10 years. I'm originally from the UK. In the last 10 plus years, I've been to red light districts around the world, conducting outreaches, operations, and trainings across the US, South America, Asia, and Europe. I feel like this event is extremely timely, knowing that it's the United Nations 16 days of activism against the violence of women and girls. And I am convinced that there is no greater system of violence and inequality against women and girls than the system of prostitution. It is a global industry of commercial sexual exploitation. And the reason I use the term the sex trade and prostitution is because when we're talking about sex trafficking, women and children are trafficked into these very industries, prostitution. We must talk about the violence in this industry. The largest study on prostitution across 9 different nations showed that 63% of women in prostitution have been raped, 71% physically assaulted, 68% met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, same as combat veterans and victims of state-organized torture. Another study showed that women in prostitution exhibit the same rate of traumatic brain injury as documented torture survivors. 92% of trafficked women report being subjected to physical violence, shot at, strangled, burnt, beaten, stabbed, and punched. This is very devastating information, and I will say it is consistent with what I have personally seen and been told firsthand by survivors. Women have told me of near-death experiences at the hands of traffickers and sex buyers. Stories of near-death experiences being thrown out of cars or escaping, nearly dying. I've heard from survivors who have been thrown from 3-story buildings by sex buyers after refusing a sex act. I know one survivor who survived, who had facial reconstruction surgery. I've seen branding tattoos and scarred arms from self-harming and cutting. The post-traumatic stress disorder with survivors of trafficking that I've seen devastates me to my core, and that is something that our organization provides, trauma therapy for survivors. The scars of this industry are often lifelong. I've intervened in 2 near suicides where the individuals were minutes away from taking their own life. And our team recently attended the funeral of someone we knew in their life who was murdered, which is not uncommon when the mortality rate for those in prostitution is 60 to 120 times higher. There is a reason why someone who gets out of the life is called a survivor. In 2018, I led a team to Russia during the World Cup. where we conducted different outreaches, undercover operations, ultimately exposing a trafficking ring that was brought to justice eventually. One place where we did outreach was on the outskirts of Moscow in a forest where pimps would drop off their women in multiple minibuses, and our team were given permission to take care packages, including an invitation to an STD clinic, which we could invite them to. And John's sex buyers would drive down this dirt road to the forest, and they would shout a number out of their car window. And that number was the monetary rate that they were willing to pay for a girl. Each woman knew their monetary value, and so the women, if he called out the lowest number, they would come and do a line-up in front of his car. If he didn't like the look of any of them, he would shout out the next highest monetary number he'd be willing to pay, and the next bus of girls would come out. I saw this with my own eyes, and even after doing this work for multiple years, I felt like someone was punching me in the gut. I thought of no greater dehumanizing expression of women being bought and sold and valued in this way. And then just the horror of seeing one girl with often 2 or 3 men drive down either into the forest or out onto the highway to a hotel, not knowing what could happen to her that night. Over here in the US, we have one state, Nevada, which has legalized brothels. And a few years ago, I did multiple outreaches in these brothels. Upon walking in, a bell is rung, and all the women in the brothel are called to do a lineup in front of you. And I felt deeply uncomfortable because I was put in the position of a sex buyer. And I asked if any of the women would like to speak to me. I didn't want to have to select a woman. I was just there to spend time with them, speak with them, and frankly, research more about what is taking place inside these legal brothels in Nevada. Every time the women were not allowed to choose whether whether they would like to give me a tour, I had to select a woman. And I can tell you that the visual of Russia and Nevada was strikingly similar. No matter the cultural expression, one thing remains consistent. The sex trade is an industry of violence and inequality against women and children, often the most vulnerable and marginalized. A more recent development and expression that I've seen is the online sexual exploitation. Trafficking victims not only experience the physical exploitation, but now they are also filmed by traffickers or buyers, and these videos are used to either market them or uploaded to porn sites. We've seen pornography websites that have nothing in place to verify age or consent. And our organization powered a campaign which became a global movement called Trafficking Hub in 2020, exposing that even prominent websites such as Pornhub did not have adequate procedures in place to verify age and consent, resulting in hundreds, possibly thousands of illegal videos on their site. At the end of 2020, Pornhub was forced to delete 80% of their website, which was 10 million videos. They blamed our organization in their statement, which I took for them giving us credit. And since then, we have proposed new laws that need to be put in place to adequately verify age and consent, because we know that these million-dollar websites care more about money than people. We've seen an explosion of revenge porn, better termed image-based sexual abuse, and children being used in webcam exploitation and child sexual abuse material. Meanwhile, the porn industry and porn sites profit from the violent fantasies of rape and torture. Prior to their purge, a result for a search on Pornhub for the term waterboarding produced more than 100,000 results. The sex trade is built on principles of inequality, gender inequality, where we see that 99% of buyers are men, or men taking a female partner to the brothel or hotel. 70 to 98% of victims are women or those who identify as women. Secondly, economic inequality. Most sex buyers, according to the largest study on sex buyers ever done, earn more than $100,000 per year. They have a disposable income. Traffickers make hundreds of thousands per year from each victim they exploit. Racial inequality. Black and indigenous people of color are overly represented consistently in the sex industry. I was in Europe throughout the summer and was consistently told that in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, it's not native women who are being exploited and sold, and that was what I saw for myself. It's immigrant women from the most poor and marginalized countries. And lastly, power inequality. between the trafficker and the woman, but also the buyer, who has the power, the agency, the money, the control, the choice. The prostituted woman was most likely sexually abused as a child. Up to 84% experience this. And we commonly see foster care youth, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, often from a sexual or racial minority, immigrants, single mothers. There is a significant power imbalance in prostitution. For me, being in Amsterdam over the summer and still in the year 2022, seeing women behind windows being commodified and sold was like a slap in my face as a woman. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary declared 2022's word of the year to be gaslighting. Now, gaslighting is the act or practice of grossly misleading someone for someone else's advantage. I think this word is actually a perfect term for what we're currently seeing taking place in our culture. Women and girls are being gaslit by a multi-billion-dollar sex industry to believe that the sex trade is not the system of oppression and violence that we know it to be, but somehow rebranded as empowering, liberating, sex positive. The capitalization and commodification of women's bodies and sexuality is everything feminism fought against. Billion-dollar porn sites such as Pornhub and OnlyFans are now the new pimps. Even the term sex worker seems to normalize exploitation as work and is so vague that many don't realize it actually includes third parties. Traffickers, brothel owners, and pimps, often who are quoted in the media. If you do background research, they are financially profiting from the individuals that they're exploiting. To say you're fighting for sex workers' rights then begs the question, whose rights are you fighting for? The rights of pimps to trade girls and own brothels? The rights of economically privileged middle-class men to rent vulnerable women's bodies for sex? The rights of women to be exploited in an industry that puts them at extreme risk of violence and harm every day, often causing lifelong PTSD, and call it a job like any other? This is surely the sex industry's biggest gaslighting scam of all. We believe we must fight for a better world for women and children where they are offered exit services, housing, jobs, not jail. A world where she doesn't have to sell her body to survive, and a world where traffickers and abusers are actually held accountable to the full extent of the law. 13 years into this work, I feel the urgency for prevention more than ever. To me, prevention is identifying the most vulnerable populations and seeking to actively reduce their vulnerability through outreach and education, and secondly, reducing demand. Trafficking is an issue of supply and demand. No buyers equals no business. We have two choices. Pass legislation that will shrink the sex trade, help women exit, offer opportunities, and still hold buyers and pimps accountable. A law that we support called the Abolitionist Equality Model, or pass legislation that will fully legalize the sex industry, turning states and nations into pimp states, removing all social and criminal deterrents from buyers and aspiring traffickers. More demand always equals more supply. Worldwide, we must urgently focus our efforts on shrinking exploitation, not growing it. There is lots of work to be done here at home and globally, and look, I know this is a complex issue and sex trafficking cannot easily be uprooted overnight. But the long-term roadmap is clear. If we want to see gender equality, we must pass the equality model to uproot sex trafficking. If we want to see women and children protected from the recurring trauma of image-based sexual abuse online, we must pass laws to protect them and hold websites hosting their abuse criminally accountable. That is our vision, and we won't stop until we see it, because women and children and survivors deserve our best fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I would invite everyone to really visit the Exodus Cry's website to see. They have a lot of really helpful material that breaks down what is an abolitionist approach to trafficking, and what it means, and what it entails practically, and to really eye-opening material, very high production value. Just to give you a taste, we'd like to show you a video produced by